Hey folks, it's January 1st, 2026. And I hope a lot of you are doing something other than sitting at the computer today and they're spending time with family or just taking the day off. But for those of you who did want to hear from me today, I thought I would talk a little bit about new beginnings. American history has a number of new beginnings on January 1st. We get the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But what I wanted to talk about today was another new beginning in 1892. And that is that January 1st, 1892 is the opening of Ellis Island. And that seems a particularly good thing to talk about today after the last couple of days of really hideous anti immigrant language coming out of this administration. There are a number of people in this administration who seem to believe that immigrants pose a really profound danger to the United States. They have shifted a number of people from actually investigating crimes into trying to deport undocumented immigrants and immigrants who are here legally, because they really seem to believe that somehow immigration creates a civilizational challenge to the United States of America. It's hard to imagine anything that is less American than the idea that immigrants are a threat to our country. And I thought it might be fun to go a little bit through how we got to Ellis Island and how we got to the idea of making sure that there was a system for regular immigration to the United States. So here goes for January 1st, 2026. Until we get regularization of immigration in the United States, of course, people just come. They come on boats, and to the degree that they're processed at all, they're processed by states and they're processed on the docks as they come off the boats. And that presents a problem from the very beginning. Probably not the problem that you're thinking of. The problem that people recognize from the beginning of the 19th century, at least, is that immigrants coming from other countries, some of whom don't speak English, and certainly are not accustomed to the bustling seaports in which they're landing on the East Coast, are at the mercy of swindlers who come to them and say, hey, yeah, we can find a place for you to live, or we can get you a job. All you got to do is pay us some money up front. And you know exactly what happens next. Those people disappear. And that then creates a problem not only for the immigrants who are coming and their families, but also for the localities where they are, because they suddenly don't have jobs and they don't have any money, and they are likely to become victims of crime or to become wards of or on the charge they're going to cost the cities and the states to support them until they can get back on their feet. So this becomes an increasing problem in the 1840s and the 1850s for a very simple reason. Immigration goes up a lot in those decades. And the reason it goes up a lot is stuff you've all heard about before. People from Ireland begin to come in large numbers because they're escaping the potato famine. People from Germany start to come in very large numbers because there's been a big revolution. The 48ers of 1848, the 48ers begin to come to the United States in large numbers. So you have the Irish and you have the Germans coming to the East Coast, and other people as well, but those are the people who really start to come in large numbers in the 1840s and the 1850s. And then on the West Coast, and it is always a mistake to forget about the West Coast when people talk about immigration, but on the West Coast, after the discovery of gold in 1848, you get a huge influx of people coming to mine or pan for gold. Two different things. Mining is digging, panning is using water to get the flakes of gold out of the beds of rivers. They begin to come in 1849. That's why we have those songs about miner, 49ers. It's 1849 because that's when people really start to come to mine the gold. And they come often from China to work in the gold fields. They also come either from Mexico or they stay in the United States after the border of Mexico moves over them with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is also 1848. Or they come from other South American countries where mining is pretty common, so they know what they're doing, including Chile, for example. So in the 1840s and the 1850s, a lot of new people coming to the East Coast and a lot of new people coming to the West Coast. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But the reason we focus on the East Coast when we think about immigration in this period is because by 1855, the state of New York, where so many people are going through New York Harbor, recognizes that it's got an issue. It's got to find some way to protect immigrants and to process them safely. So one of the things that it does, the state does, is that it requires those bringing immigrants to pay a head fee. That is to it's a very complicated fee. I'm not going to go into how it works, but essentially they have to cover the expenses of people who might come in who can't support themselves, so they don't become a charge on the city of New York or on the state of New York. As I say, it's complicated, and the reason I'm emphasizing that it's complicated is because there's going to be a Supreme Court case about it in a little bit. But they charge the people who are bringing the immigrants, but then they establish a state facility for processing immigrants in 1855, and that processing facility is the Emigrant Landing Depot, more commonly known as Castle Garden. That's probably how you know it, as Castle Garden, which is a reference to something that happened on that site earlier than it becomes a depot for immigrants. And between the time that Castle Garden opens in August of 1855 and the time that we have the last recorded data from it in 1889, December of 1889, Castle Garden processes 75% of the immigrants who come to the United States in that period. That means Castle Garden processes 8 million of the almost 11 million immigrants who come to the United States between 1855 and 1889. So what happens is that when immigrants come to Castle Garden, the officials first divide them into English speakers and non-English speakers who are going to need translators, and then they make records of who's coming. They record their names. They record the names of the ships that they came on. They record where they're going, and they record how much money they have. Again, they're concerned about the idea that these people will not end up being self-supporting. But they also do something else at Castle Garden, and that is they provide places where you can exchange money without getting swindled. That's a big deal. They enable immigrants to buy railroad tickets from licensed agents, so they're not going to get ripped off there. They provide a place for them to contact their relatives, and they provide places for them to wash and to rest themselves before they go on to the next leg of their journey. So you got Castle Garden beginning in 1855. But what's going to happen in 5 years? A little bit more than that, 6 years. You get the Civil War. And immigration begins to fall off dramatically during the Civil War, both because people are concerned about coming to a war-torn country, but also because new immigrants are terrified they're going to end up getting thrown right on the front lines, that they're simply going to become cannon fodder for this incredibly bloody war. So immigration begins to fall off at the same time that the United States begins an economic boom. And that economic boom is partly in the industries of that time, which are beginning to become bigger, to become national industries, not nationalized, they don't belong to the government, but national industries that serve a national market because of the needs of the Union during the war. But also, one of the things that happens during the war is that there is a drought through Europe. And when there's a drought through Europe, and with the incredible need of the armies for food, there's a huge boom in U.S. agriculture, but there aren't people to grow the food. So by 1863, both the president, Abraham Lincoln, and Congress is extremely concerned about being able to have enough immigrants to produce the food that the armies need and that Europe needs, and that is also bringing gold into the United States with the export of agricultural products. So beginning in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln actually asks Congress to get involved in encouraging immigration to the United States. And I always love this because, of course, Lincoln is the leader of the Republican Party, which has changed dramatically since that time. He believes that immigrants create wealth through their labor. They take raw materials and their labor transforms them into something that's saleable, a very common idea at the time. And he wrote to Congress in December of 1863, there is a great deficiency of laborers in every field of industry, especially in agriculture and in our mines. as well of iron and coal as of the precious metals, while tens of thousands of persons destitute of remunerative occupation, that is, they don't have jobs, are thronging our foreign consulates and are thronging our foreign consulates and offering to emigrate to the United States if essential but very cheap assistance can be afforded them. Well, in fact, this is the case with that drought. There's a lot of people who know how to farm who would love to come to the United States, but they have no money to do it. So he wants Congress to make sure these people can get to the United States. And he says, the nation is beginning a new life, and this noble effort demands the aid and ought to receive the attention and support of the government. And so in 1864, the Republicans in Congress agree with him, and Congress goes ahead and passes a law to enable immigrants to borrow against their future homesteads so that they can fund their trips to the United States and then take advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862 to take up land, but also guarantees that they will not be drafted to fight in the war until such time as they declare their intention to become citizens, and they don't have to do that. So this essentially says you don't have to worry about getting stuck on the front lines. At the same time, in their 1864 political platform, the Republican Party resolves that immigration should be fostered and encouraged by a liberal and just policy. All right, so America is desperate to get immigrants during the Civil War and immediately after the war, and immigration begins to pick up. But then we get first a recession, and then what we believe is a depression after the Panic of 1873, which someday I'll write about or tell you more about. But when that happens, that changes America's relationship with immigration, because California has been off by itself. It hasn't really been connected to the East Coast before the 1869 completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So California workers actually, when that railroad is connected between the East Coast and the West Coast, they go into an economic depression faster than the rest of the country, because now they've got competition coming from the East, and prices in California have been really artificially inflated by the gold out there. And when that happens, California workers become very angry at the Asian workers, the Chinese workers who came over to work in the gold fields, but also worked on the railroads. And after the railroad is completed in 69, they tend to go back to the West Coast cities. And when they go back to the West Coast cities, workers get really angry at the idea that they're competing for jobs. So what happens is that in 1875, we get the first federal regulation of U.S. immigration. And most people forget about it because it's pretty toothless. It is the 1875 Page Act. And the Page Act prohibits the migration of contract laborers, that is Chinese workers who are under contract to the contract brokers in the West, but also alleged sex workers are not permitted to come to the U.S., but it didn't have any facilities for or any requirements about the inspection of ships to see if the ships were carrying people like that. And it also provided no way for the government to enforce those provisions. So it's an important act because it recognizes the animosity of West Coast white Americans to Chinese laborers, and also because it's the first sort of federal toehold in the idea of the regulation of immigration. But what's more important than that for regulation is that Supreme Court decision I mentioned to you before, which happens in 1876, the year after the Page Act. And in that, it's called Henderson versus the Mayor of New York. The Supreme Court decides that all state taxes, head taxes, they're, like I said, they're not literally head taxes. It's pretty complicated how it works, on immigrants are unconstitutional. Excuse me. They can't do that. And so what that does is it suddenly means that the states, like New York with Castle Garden, but also other states that had ways to protect immigrants, suddenly don't have any money to make sure that their facilities for processing immigrants and for making sure they don't get taken advantage of, they don't have any money to do that anymore. So that creates a real pressure, not just on the part of people who are concerned about the expense of immigrants to cities if they come destitute, but also to advocates for immigrants to say we got to do something at a federal level because otherwise we got ourselves a real problem here. So there's this real push to have some kind of federal regulation of immigration, but guess who doesn't like it? The people who don't like the idea of any kind of federal regulation of immigration are the ship owners and the business people. The ship owners don't like it because they don't want to have to pay those head taxes. Again, that's not literally what they are, but let's call them that. They don't want to pay those things, so they're perfectly happy to say, "Hey, we're just going to deliver these people and dump them off on the docks, and you guys have to worry about it." Businessmen are perfectly happy not to have any regulation because they would like to be standing on the dock saying, "Hey, come work for me," without any, without really having any competition. But reformers are really concerned about the collapse of those immigrant services, and they really push for there to be some kind of regulation of immigrants coming to the United States. At the same time that on the West Coast, there is continued agitation for regulation of Asian workers coming into the United States. And there's also pressure from state governments and city governments saying, "Hey, don't bring people over here and dump them on the docks because then we got starving children in our streets and we don't have the money to pay for them." And the interesting thing to me is how many of these arguments are still current, right? But so Congress doesn't turn to it very quickly because the country's in a depression. Well, one of the reasons there's a pushback against Asian labor is because of the fact that there's not enough work to go around. So they don't really bother to get their acts together for a while. And then pressure begins to rise again in 1879, and when the economy starts to recover, and also after the election of 1880, because in the election of 1880, Republicans recognize that anti-Asian sentiment in California is helping the Democrats, and they know they've got to get on board that, or they feel they've got to get on board that. There's a big move of Republicans who don't want to get on board that, but they think they have to get back the idea of keeping out Asian labor in order to repair their fortunes for the 1884 election, the presidential election coming up. So in 1882, we get two major pieces of immigration legislation in the United States. And people often know the first and not the second. The first is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibits the immigration of Chinese workers to the United States. But as a reflection of this frustration of white workers with the Asian immigrants that they assume are taking their jobs, and they're rioting against them and they're attacking them and so on. The Exclusion Act does not prohibit scholars, businessmen, or diplomats. I mean, it's very clearly aimed at Chinese workers. But then here's the law that we often forget, and that's that 3 months after the Chinese Exclusion Act, we see the Immigration Act of 1882. And the Immigration Act of 1882 imposes a head tax on immigrants. It also, which is going to create a fund for the kinds of services I talked about and the kinds of inspections that I talked about, but also creates prohibitive categories for immigrants coming into the United States. So it prohibits the entry of convicts, people deemed mentally ill, and any person unable to take care of him or herself. This is an attempt to guarantee that anybody who comes over is not going to become a charge on the government where they land. So in 1882, you get a continuation of the 1875 Page Act with the Chinese Exclusion Act, expanding those categories to say, we're not going to allow any Chinese workers in the country going forward, although it's okay if you're a scholar or a diplomat. And then 3 months later, in the West Coast, and then 3 months later on the East Coast, you get the Immigration Act of 1882, which both creates a fund for the kind of services I talked about, and also prohibits certain people from coming, especially those deemed too poor or in some fashion disabled and unwelcome in American society. All right, so what happens then? After 1882, Congress in 1891 modifies the second of those two laws that I mentioned because they recognize that the government has got to take a much stronger hand in the kind of immigration regulation that they are talking about. So they want to create their own federal immigration bureau. They want to both process their own legal immigrations, set up this legal system, and they want to enforce restrictions against those people who are deemed unable to enter the US. And at the same time, they want to provide services. So, what the new law of 1891 does is that it expands the reasons that people can be rejected from the United States, including anybody who has a physical illness or a contagious disease. And it creates a federal system for processing people coming to the United States to make sure that the people who come pass those things. It also creates a system for welcoming immigrants who do make it through that screening. Now, what they do then is, because of the fact that ship owners or the people who are moving the immigrants from Europe to the United States have to pay to themselves to return anybody who is not going to pass the system. And because they also have to pay head tax on them, many of them are, for the most part, they're pre-screened in Europe before they get on a boat. And that's going to matter in just a second. So what happens is officials have to come up with their own place for processing immigrants in a federal system. And what would you do? You would go talk to the people at Castle Garden, and you would say, maybe this is where we should have people come to the United States, not least because it is so strongly identified with where immigrants come to the United States that in the 1880s, that people had erected the Statue of Liberty to welcome people to the United States there in New York Harbor. So what they do is they turn to an island in New York Harbor off the shore from Castle Garden. It's a former oyster bed, and they begin to fill it in. And over time, eventually, they're going to fill it in until it becomes about 27.5 acres. But they turn to this island to create this federal system, and it is, of course, Ellis Island. And in 1892, they open a facility that has a main receiving building. It also has a hospital. It has a utility plant. It has a laundry. It has a hospital. And it has offices, of course. And it has a detention center as well. So the way it works is that immigrants arrive at Ellis Island. They sail about 2 weeks across the ocean. They enter New York Harbor, pass the Statue of Liberty, and then the ship anchors in New York Harbor. And if you are a first class or a second class passenger who is healthy, you are examined aboard ship, and you don't have to go through the kinds of inspections that are specified by the 1891 law, or at least that take place at Ellis Island. You can be inspected on the ship. So you don't have to go through this. First class, second class, you're out of there. All right. But anybody who is a third class passenger, as well as anybody from first or second class who is sick, has to get on a ferry or a barge and go to the inspection station on Ellis Island. Once they get there, they have to wait for 3 to 5 hours, although the inspection itself is only going to last a few minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, if they're in good health. If they're not in good health, it's a different kettle of fish. Hang on for that. Doctors would examine them for obvious illnesses, and officials would try to make sure by questioning them that they were going to be able to support themselves in the United States. So they, would ask them where they're coming from, where they're planning to go, that sort of question. That's in the first 2 years that that first facility is in operation. And then in June of 1897, that building those buildings I just talked about burned down. They were all wooden. So that's not what you are accustomed to seeing if you have gone to see Ellis Island, which is now a national monument. Unfortunately, when the buildings went down, they took all the immigration records with them, which is, I just can't tell you how heartbreaking those fires are. I can sit here and list fires that took archives with them, but it is what it is. Anyway, the government rebuilt almost immediately, recognized it needed to keep the facility open. So that's when we get that new receiving room that has the just spectacular windows and that Gustavino ceiling. That the Gustavino tile, I think, is one of our most beautiful things in public buildings in the United States, and private buildings, some too as well. But that's when we get that giant registry room, as it's known. And what would happen there is that people would come in and they would sit on big benches waiting to be called, because there would be ship's lists. And after the medical examiners decided that they were in fact physically fit, the legal inspectors, as they were known, would ask the immigrants' name, their hometown, where they were going, what their occupation was, what skills they had, and how much money they had. If they made it through that, and in the first pass, about 20% of those people arriving did not make it through. Ultimately, that's only going to be about 2%. The 20% either have to get their papers in order or have some kind of visible illness, and they go to the infirmary and then they come back out. Eventually, it's only about a little bit under 2% of people who get returned to Europe, as I say, because the ship owners have been pretty careful to try and screen those people because they don't want to pay to take them back. But once they go through the inspection, the newcomers go through what are called the stairs of separation. And it's worth looking. There's a video online about Ellis Island, and there is one of the videos about the stairs of separation. And looking at those stairs is, even nowadays, you just think, wow. Because if you were headed for New York or New England, again, think of the people you met on the boat that you'll never see again. You've just shared this incredible thing and you will never see them again. Or the lady that you talked to in the registry room that is going to Nebraska while you're going to New York. You'll never see them again. The stairs of separation, if you are going to New York or New England, you go down the stairs on the right. So these are a set of stairs with balusters, handrails down them. If you're going to New York or New England, you go down the stairs to the right. If you are, if you're going to New England or New York, you go down the left stairs. If you're going anywhere else, you go down the stairs to the right. But if you're not leaving, if you're going to the dormitory or to the hospital, you go down the stairs to the middle. So it's all the same staircase, but there are these handrails, and those are the stairs of separation. That always jumps out to me. Anyway, from the bottom of the stairs, you leave Ellis Island and you go out to meet relatives, to go out into the city and to go to get trains to wherever it is you're going to get. But Ellis Island, in the years of its operation, which are between 1892 and 1954, more than 12 million people go through Ellis Island. So a lot of us have people who went through Ellis Island. You combine that with Castle Garden, which is about 11 million. That's another 12 million who goes through Ellis Island. That's about 23 million people coming through New York and that facility, those facilities between 1855 and 1954, about 100 years come through New York. And then more, of course, come through the West Coast, including Angel Island, which I'm not going to talk about now. Because the reason that I wanted to focus today on Ellis Island was not simply because of the anniversary, although I love anniversaries. I think it's really cool. But because guess who came through Ellis Island? You know the answer to this. Stephen Miller, who is the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, who is the one who is so virulently anti-immigrant, the idea that immigrants are somehow polluting the United States, His people came through Ellis Island in 1903. They were did not speak English, and his family was part of this great migration that, by the way, the Trump administration has tried to get UNESCO to recognize as a World Heritage Site because of its importance to human migrations throughout history. They did that in his first term. And that just seems, on this first day of 2026, to be worth calling out, that anniversary, and the fact that the United States really is a nation of immigrants. I also like the idea that with that recognition, we recognize that as the immigrants came through New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty, after 1903, the year that Stephen Miller's people came through Ellis Island, we had got added to the Statue of Liberty the poem that Emma Lazarus wrote in 1883 as a way to raise money to build the pedestal for the statue. The statue was a gift from France, but Americans had to raise the money for the pedestal, and the real effort to do that took place in 1883. And she put in the poem this imagery of how the Statue of Liberty was the new Colossus, as opposed to the old Colossus being the one that stood at the harbor to the island of Rhodes and was known as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. She called Lady Liberty the new Colossus, the mother of exiles. And she said of her in this poem, a reference again to the old Colossus, "Keep ancient lands your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." And on this first day of January 2026, that just seems like such a great answer to those people who think that immigration is not a fundamental part of who we as Americans are, on this anniversary of the opening of Ellis Island. I wish for all of us, American immigrants, as well as Americans who are already here and ones who are born here, fabulous 2026.